Welcome back to the Jesus Discussion. We're glad you joined us. And, once again, we're not a podcast or a show that's trying to sell itself, based on our status or our position or our authority, but we really want to just get into these ancient writings and these ancient people, the origin of all of this discussion about Jesus. And though we're people of faith, we welcome you from wherever you hail from or whatever your views are. It's inevitable that we might disagree about life in the universe, but we should be able to come to some consensus about what ancient literature meant within the time that it was written. One of the framing elements of the good news, according to Mark, is this opening sentence where, it says that this is the good news of Jesus, the Anointed One, which is their reference for king or Messiah, right. And that he is the Son of God. And it's the beginning of the good news of Jesus, the Anointed One, the Son of God. And that the reason we keep bringing that up is because that is a pretty good framing device for a framing sentence for the whole narrative of Mark. And Mark is a really good writer. He's a really compelling writer. If you read this in the first century, it would be, they didn't have the New York Times bestseller, list and all of that, but it would be a really hot and fascinating, intriguing read for this first century. Now, we went with the baptism of Jesus, the calling of the first disciples, and through kind of the first little group of miracles, and these stories are all arranged in a certain way for a certain purpose. And then we started in chapter 2, where these 4 friends dig a hole in the roof and lower their paralytic friend down, and Jesus heals them and causes this big stir. They're all amazed, and that's where we pick up here at verse 13 of chapter 2. Does that pretty much sum up everything we've got, Everett?
I think so. And we'll keep coming back to those opening words of Mark's treatise, because you're right. He starts with that assertion, and he really wraps up the gospel at the end with that assertion. And everything that goes in between fits into the context of what he's trying to say.
Right. And so we know that there were all of these stories about the ancient Jesus. There were probably things that were talked about and shared that never made it into any writing. And so the people who wrote were writing for a reason, and they collected certain stories for a reason. So we know there were probably, Everett, lots of stories shared about who Jesus was and what Jesus did all throughout this first century era. We've mentioned before that John in his writing says that there's probably not enough libraries, not enough books in all the libraries in all the world to write down everything that Jesus said and did. And so what had happened was these people who did wrote for a specific reason. And it wouldn't be any different. It's no different than when we write a biography of someone now. We're not including every little bit of minutia, every time they comb their hair and brush their teeth, and just putting it there for the reader to assimilate and make sense. When you're writing that kind of a writing, you are presenting certain things so that the reader gets a sense of what you're trying to say as the writer. And that's what these ancient writers are doing. Now, all of the stories that they take from are stories that many of them are quoted in other and retold in other of these early writings. And they believe these things that they're saying. These things were all written, within a generation, roughly, of the first people who heard them. So these are, first and second-hand witnesses sharing stories about things that happened, but they're assembled for a narrative reason. And so you pick this story and that story and this story because you want people to see this aspect of who Jesus was. And so we're going to go back and look at how that works. And we pick up here in verse 13, after some friends have lowered their their friend down through the roof, dug a hole in the roof. That's what we talked about in our last episode. And after this happens, there's a challenge from the scribes. And then the narrative moves on, and Mark says, and he went out again by the seashore and all the people were coming to him, and he was teaching them. And we talked about the different meanings of that word, because that's also the same thing that's said about John in chapter 1, John the Baptizer or John the Baptist, that all the people were coming. And so, Everett, you had mentioned that can mean all or people from everywhere.
Yeah, it can mean all without exception, or it can mean all without distinction, which is that's not my original take on it, but it's true that when we in our modern or our contemporary culture, when we hear the word all, we think all without exception, and that's not the way many times it's used in the New Testament. It very often is used to mean a lot of people, or all without distinction, like all classes of people or all strata of society were coming to see him, rather than every single person. Because if that were true, then I don't know what the population of the world was at that point, but there would have been 1 billion people outside his door.
Right. There's also a connotation of crowds, though, as well. Would you say, with the way that those words are phrased, both in John and here with Jesus, that even though he's not saying all, everyone without extinction, without distinction, but he's saying that all types and all manner of people were coming, but he's still implying that there were a lot of people coming.
Right.
Right. Yeah, we don't want to say everyone from everywhere in a literal sense, but there were crowds coming. And Mark is likely pointing out that the crowds that are coming as a diverse group of people. You're talking about a community right here in the Levant, in Jerusalem. You're talking about a highly diverse and oftentimes polarized community. The Herodians are one group, and the Sadducees are a group that is controlling what was the controlling group behind the temple and what's going on there. And the Pharisees are not in line with the Sadducees, and they're also an influential group. And then you have the Essenes, and then if you look at like the Dead Sea Scrolls, you have these other likely minor sects, Qumran Covenanteers as they're called, and all of these various peoples, the Zealots. So you have a wide variety of people, including also the Romans.
Right. And that's the point behind when Mark says all the people were coming to him.
Since we've exhausted all there is about all of the people.
How much can you say about one word?
I don't know. How much time do we have? So let's pick up here at verse 14. I'm reading in the NASB, the 2020 version of the NASB. As he passed by, he saw Levi, the son of Alphaeus, sitting in the tax office, and he said to him, "Follow me." And he got up and followed him. And it happened that he was reclining at the table in his house, and many tax collectors and sinners were dining with Jesus and his disciples, for there were many of them, and they were following him. When the scribes of the Pharisees saw that he was eating with the sinners and tax collectors, they said to the disciples, "Why is he eating with tax collectors and sinners?" And hearing this, Jesus said to them, "It is not those who are healthy who need a physician, but those who are sick. I do not come to call the righteous, but sinners." John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting, and they came and said to him, "Why do John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast?" And Jesus said to them, "While the groom is with them, the attendants of the groom cannot fast, can they? As long as they have the groom with them, they cannot fast. But the days will come when the groom is taken away from them, and they will fast on that day. No one sews a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old garment. Otherwise, the patch pulls away from it, the new from the old, and a worse tear results. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins. Otherwise, the wine will burst the skins, and the wine is lost, and the skins as well. But one puts new wine into fresh wineskins. So that's kind of a big chunk there, but it's all one flow of thought. So that's kind of one big chunk, and we've got this calling of Matthew. I think it'd be important if you're reading this and you've just thought, oh, tax collectors, nobody likes the IRS, you might be a little askew on what it meant to be a tax collector in Jerusalem in the first century and who this guy Matthew was. Everett, do you have some information on that? Yeah.
Mark identifies the tax collector as Levi, the son of Alphaeus. But we know from other writings that he was also known as Matthew. So that's why we refer to him as Matthew, the tax collector. The tax collector was essentially sort of like an independent contractor of the Roman Empire. And the Romans had the taxes that were due, and he had to collect those. But he had behind him the force and the authority of the Roman government. And so he could collect beyond what was actually due to the Roman magistrates. And so the tax collectors were thought of as robbers. Not like we think of the IRS, because one big difference is the IRS will tell you, don't pay more than you owe. These guys had just the opposite philosophy because that's how they enriched themselves. And you didn't say no to them because whatever they assessed, you had to pay it. They had a sort of a double whammy in that this tax collector, based on his name and where he was a Jew. And so the Jews who hated the Roman occupation of their land, which they believed was something that God gave them, and here are these Roman conquerors, and so this man is a Jew who is collaborating with the Roman government. So they sort of had a double, hatred that they had to overcome.
Right. Imagine that a foreign nation is occupying your country, your nation, and they have military people all over. And your buddy that you went to school with starts working for them, taking money from you.
It's not a happy scene.
No, you're not going to be the popular kid. There's stories about that, and even on TV, there's all sorts of narratives that are highly entertaining about the turncoat who works with the enemy, the sellout, and you kind of have that thing going on. And additionally, if he's up there, I don't want to make too much of his location, but the location of Matthew, is it Capernaum, Everett?
Yeah. Verse 1, it tells us it was Capernaum.
Right. So that's the northern part of the Sea of Galilee, right? And you've got the Golan Heights, and you've got people of affluence living around there who might pass through that area on their way to the temple.
Mm-hmm.
So he's not set up in a bad spot. He's set up in a spot to really line his pockets.
Right.
And here he's taxing his fellow countrymen on behalf of another government that nobody likes, that they feel is not just, usurping their right, but usurping their sovereign or divine right.
And that's the key. So he was not only a collaborator with the enemy, but many Jews considered them enemies of God.
Mm-hmm. And so we have some of this initial expectation that is echoed throughout Mark's writing, that the idea that these ancient Jews expected when Messiah comes, he's going to be someone who hangs out with all of the currently important people and validates the currently important regime. He's not going to change what we're doing. This is kind of what I point out in terms of John's baptism upsetting people.
Mm-hmm.
If, you used to teach, 5 or 10 young men at the temple every week, and you're a scribe or a religious leader, and all of a sudden there's 8 of the 10 who are there, and a couple are missing, and you ask about where they are, and they're off getting baptized by John against the things you're teaching, that doesn't make you happy.
Right.
And so these people are not, I don't believe that the average person who is initially put off by Jesus is thinking in their heart, I'm a bad person. And how few people on earth look in the mirror and think, I'm a bad person. We all have a narrative that we believe.
Mm-hmm.
And so the expectation is that Jesus is going to go along with what's currently going on in the religious circles, in the circles of leadership, if he's going to be the Messiah. And that's why it's so shocking then that for them that he turns around and he's hanging out with this hated tax collector, this enemy of God, and he's spending his time there.
Right. And it's significant that Mark says he was at the table and many tax collectors and sinners. So that's the group that tax collectors and sinners go together there.
Right. And that doesn't even faze Jesus.
No.
He's just hanging out with them. And, oftentimes I hear from people who, they don't want to talk about Jesus. They don't want to talk about faith, or they don't want to talk about these ancient writings. One of the initial things that comes up is their reticence to engage in a conversation that's going to make them feel judged. And yet here the Pharisees and religious leaders are the ones bringing the attitude of judgment.
Right. So Jesus is reaching out to the lowest, I don't want to say lowest class. I'm not making that judgment, but they were considered by their contemporaries some of the lowest classes of people. And just calling the fishermen was Jesus reaching out to a group that was not highly regarded in contemporary society. So he's reaching out to people, and he's associating with people that he's reaching out to those people, and they're receiving that welcome, but it's not ingratiating himself to the religious leadership.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's I can imagine these people working their whole life at the temple, being devout in their faith, really thinking and dreaming about what if Messiah comes and how awesome would it be because I'll be so important, because look at all the work that I've been doing and who I am and my position and my status. And then you get slighted by this guy. The rumors are circulating that this might be the guy, and he calls fishermen and hangs out with tax collectors. And we get the story of Levi here.
Right.
And so the Jesus reply then is great. Always, Jesus reply. I personally am a fan of the way that Jesus replies and keeps it from being, how do you say, nebulously stoic and spiritual. He uses some really tangible examples for the people at the time and makes very pointed, strong points that are not just spiritual rabble and axiomatic stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So he asks some very pointed questions, and we see some of his, really creative but clear in meaning responses. In verse 17, it's not the healthy who need a physician, but the sick. I didn't come to call people who are righteous, but sinners. I didn't come to call the righteous, but sinners. If you're already doing a good thing, great. Then you don't really need to be called, right? You don't. It's the other people,
or at least or at least you don't think you need to be called, and you're not going to follow if I do call you because you think you've got it all together.
Exactly. And that's a great point, because he was asking people to repent from the current religious paradigm that was there, to change their mind and to see the reason, the very reason for the narrative, the very reason that these are, they carry their tradition of being, children of Abraham and children of the promise and the covenant. He's asking them to see that whole divine purpose that this group of people see in a different way, through the things that he will continue to explain in as Mark points out. And then we have this analogy of the groom at a feast and fasting. And Everett, do you want to give us a little bit of context on that?
Well, the first century Hebrew wedding customs were a little bit different than we do today. Today we have an event. It's called the wedding ceremony, and then after the wedding ceremony, there might be a reception or some kind of you go to a venue, and then after that's over, everybody goes home. But then the whole wedding event, if you will, was something that lasted a while. And there were times when they would get together and feast. It was a party, and they wouldn't fast. They wouldn't think about foregoing food, because this is, part of the wedding party. This is how you celebrate with the groom and the bride. But he's talking here about the groom's tradition, and that culminates with the whole process with the bride and groom going and establishing their own home. So he's saying to them, I'm the groom. And I'm the one that you've been waiting for. And so why would you fast when this is the time to rejoice and be glad that I'm with you?
Right. Why would you be fasting? And then he goes on with these other three, and I love these three because I'm a big root beer fan, and I'm not a fan of root beer flavored soda. So if you turn the can over and it has caffeine on it, I won't like it, because to have caffeine, when you brew root beer for what root beer is, it's there's no caffeine in any of those ingredients. And as long as it's a brewed beverage, it won't have caffeine unless you added caffeine somehow for no good reason. If you want good root beer,
except for the feeling you get when you drink the root beer, which makes you want more root beer.
Yeah, just go take some NoDoz. Look, I'm not advocating that. I'm just making a joke, but really, so my brother and I, we have this pipe dream of being able to brew a really good root beer, not just a drinkable root beer, but a really good root beer. So we play around with that, and we want a real brewed beverage. And so he's used we were playing around with yeast, and my brother drops off a 6-pack of root beer that he had brewed. Okay, hey, try this. And I'm like, okay, but I had to go somewhere for the weekend. When I come back, the glass bottles had, they'd blown up. So it doesn't just like, if you've ever done this, you know exactly what I'm talking about. The cap doesn't just pop off the top and then liquid spills out. Literally, the glass explodes. I had shards of glass in the sheet wall in my apartment. I had them, they even bounced off of things and dug into the opposite side of the wall. And so this is a violent metaphor. The same with the old cloth and the new cloth, that it destroys a garment. When that patch shrinks, it doesn't just make the tear worse, it pretty much wipes out the garment. And so these analogies here they're not just, hey, you know, I'm kind of doing a new thing and we'll phase out the old thing. No, the old thing is just going to be blown up. As it's not going to be around. It's going to be eliminated.
And it's not that Jesus is doing something new from God's perspective, but he's going to tear down what human beings, what people had done in establishing a system that was that's the old wineskins. And Jesus is really talking about a restoration. He's the Messiah. He's the one they've been expecting. Mm-hmm. But they're expecting it in this structure that had been built up and the expectations that had been built up by human beings. And he's saying no to that, that's got to be done away with, and getting back to really what God's purpose is and the coming of the Messiah. And so what Jesus is getting rid of is this system that people have built. He's not getting rid of the system that God had intended.
Right. And we see, I think Matthew says, writes in his writing about Jesus that not one stroke of the law is gonna pass away. And so we talked about this a little bit in past episodes, that Jesus is not giving a new definition for what it means to live as a human. He is fulfilling the divine purpose of humanity fully and completely, that if you wanted to live the best life possible, you would live exactly like Jesus.
Yeah.
That all of these rules and laws point to living like Jesus.
And Jesus doesn't do away with God's law and he fulfills it, so that we look to Jesus for everything that the Old Testament, if we can use that expression, everything that the Jewish scriptures up to that point had led people to. He's the fulfillment of all that.
Right. So then he's talking about really blowing up what, as you said, what they had made of it is going to be such a shock and a difference from what it actually was intended to do and lead to.
Right.
So then these analogies, these strong analogies, are not God changing his mind, but they're pointing out how far away from the intent of God they had gotten when Jesus had said these things.
Mm-hmm.
All right, I think that gives us a good understanding of that section. Do you want to finish out this last chapter 23 through, or this last part of how they've divided the chapters? The question of the Sabbath kind of relates to these stories.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So let me just read this real quick, and maybe we can tie the pericope that we read the short story or teaching that we read in the last podcast about the healing of the paralytic with this challenge about Matthew and the purpose of Messiah and what Jesus is doing, which then connects to this question, this Sabbath challenge, as many of the commentators put in the subheading that they added in many, many years later. Here we go at verse 23. And it happened that he was passing through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples began to make their way along while picking the heads of grain. The Pharisees were saying to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he was in need, and he and his companions became hungry? How he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar the high priest, and ate the consecrated bread, which is not lawful for anyone to eat except the priests. And he also gave it to those who were with him." Jesus said to them, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. The Son of Man is Lord, even of the Sabbath."
That's a powerful statement.
Right. And you pointed out before, we're not talking about the son of a man. we're talking about the title Son of Man that was written throughout many of the prophets. I believe, Ezekiel, Isaiah, Daniel, Zechariah, the Son of Man was a proper noun used to denote a title of someone that would come. And so Jesus is connecting himself to that.
Yes.
And to be Lord of the Sabbath, I mean, the Sabbath was given by God.
And the Sabbath, it's hard to emphasize or overemphasize the role of the Sabbath in Jewish thinking. There are a few things that through the centuries have really held the Jews together. One of them is Passover, which we'll deal with more later. But the other one is the Sabbath, this weekly time of rest and worship, at least it's supposed to be. And if you go to Israel today, there are a lot of places that are closed on Sabbath. And what Jesus is saying here is that, yes, God gave the Sabbath this important weekly time of rest and worship. This is something that God gave, but Jesus is saying, I am the Lord of the Sabbath, even the Sabbath. So it's a powerful statement about Jesus' relationship to God and the law and humanity.
Right. And Mark tells it, remember just earlier in how, modern scholars have divided the chapters, but we'll say chapter 2 or just a couple of short stories ago, he said he connected himself to God in saying, talking about forgiving sins. Who can forgive sins but God alone? But so that you know that the Son of Man has the power to forgive sins. Pick up your mat and walk, and he does a miracle there. And so there's another connection. There's another one of these connections to God. We also have within it an example of, and the Roman audience might not necessarily catch all of this, but a Jewish audience understands that there are provisions within the Old Testament law, the law and the prophets, the scriptures, however you want to say it, the writings that they were depending upon to help their understanding of God and following God, and their social rules. There were provisions to pick the grain fields, at the edge along the road that they were told not to harvest all the way to the edge of the field, but leave some for the traveler and the passerby. And so the disciples are not just, stealing crops from people.
They're not in some guy's orange grove picking oranges without permission.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, they're doing something that was acceptable. And to be honest, I don't know that if they weren't Jesus' disciples, I don't know that anyone would have cared.
It's selective enforcement. It's not something that is alien to our own time. Mm-hmm. But I think that this points out, in verse 22 talks about, or in the verses above, about the old wineskins. And what Jesus and his disciples are doing here is not violating the point of the Sabbath. The Sabbath, Jesus says, was made for man to rest. It was not designed to be this hard, inflexible, cruel thing that people had to follow. And the Sabbath, God said, don't do any work. Mm-hmm. Well, then human beings came along and says, what constitutes work? And they said, well, okay, you want to know what work is? It's walking this far. It's carrying these burdens. And they got it down to really minutia, some really fine points about whether or not you can carry a needle, a sewing needle, on the Sabbath, and whether or not you can start a fire on the Sabbath, and whether you can cook, whether you can walk, so many paces, or, in our terms, it'd be so many feet or so many yards or whatever on the Sabbath. And God never specified that. That was something that people had constructed. And so when Jesus says, don't put new wine into old wineskins, this is an example of the old wineskins that people had constructed. And Jesus comes along and upsets that and says, you have it wrong. You think that man is the servant of the Sabbath, but the Sabbath was made for man.
Right. If you go back and read those laws in books like Leviticus and Deuteronomy and these Old Testament laws as they were given, they are not laws of, there's a difference between precision and accuracy, right? They are not laws that are spelling out the minutia. They're laws that are giving an example. And so then the truth of how that law should be applied should be derived from the example. Now, in our society, in America, here in the 21st century, there's often cases where we are just insanely litigious, where, someone stole someone's car, but the certain conditions happened where there isn't really the right prosecutable code for it. So they don't get arrested,
Right.
So, but everyone knows you stole his car. But the letter of the law wins out. And Jesus is calling them away from the letter of the law and toward the spirit or intention of the law with this phrase.
And God never meant that you can't eat on the Sabbath. They didn't forbid that. You could eat. So you could take a utensil, put it in a bowl, scoop up some food, put it in your mouth and chew it, and that was not a violation. But if you picked up heads of grain, and if you can imagine doing a few heads of grain, and then rubbing them together in your hands to separate the chaff, the bran, and then blowing on it to blow the bran away, which now we highly prize, and then you eat the grains of wheat, that is not the same as going out for the day and harvesting a field of wheat, or spending the day threshing the grain, separating the wheat from the bran, and then packaging up for sale. That's work. But the people had twisted God's intent so much that the disciples couldn't even pick the grain. If it had already been picked and threshed, then they could do that. They could eat it. So and you're right. This is probably an example of selective enforcement.
Right. From Mark's literary narrative or his literary flow, he's started to show from the baptism of John early in chapter 1 all the way up to now, he started to use these types of stories that give the reader a sense that the establishment isn't cool with Jesus. They're not having a good time together because the establishment generally feels slighted instead of propped up. They expected Jesus or Messiah to come and prop up what they were doing, and they felt that they were important, and they felt that they were in charge. And when you come and you have this, populist movement that doesn't go with the established regime, the establishment starts to undermine and aggressively attack what you're doing, and then look for every little letter of the law that you've stepped over that they're not enforcing with other people. And
right.
So Jesus is really artful in his replies. He's poignant. He's on topic. He says things that people really understand, that, you would have a sense of the wineskins analogy and the clothing analogy in this society that would makes sense to you, and the drama of the chasm of difference between the old wineskin and new wineskin would resonate. And we also have that Mark is a good storyteller. I keep saying that, but I can't emphasize that enough, that he doesn't tell you everything in one sentence in a linear fashion.
Right.
He leads you along with these really interesting story after story after story to show you, not tell you, in a sense. Right. There's also another overtone to the Sabbath that I don't want to spend too much time on, because I don't think it's the key focus. But if you believe that you are God's chosen people and this is God's chosen land and these are God's rules and you're honoring God's rules correctly and you should take a day off, and everywhere in the Roman Empire they have a 7-day work week, but you don't, then you don't just honor the Sabbath for your own religious value. You also honor it because it was a win that you got with Rome. It was a political win. It was,
right.
And so to not honor the Sabbath is to kind of cave on a point, on a social and moral point that you had won against your oppressors. So there's that kind of a, they're trying to pick on him and say, look, he's not with us.
Yeah, anything that they can do to alienate the followers of Jesus from him, to discredit him. He doesn't obey God. He hangs out with people that are outcasts and shouldn't be touched because they're defiled and unclean. And so they go after him on every little point. But yeah, you're right that one of the things that really intensifies the importance of the Sabbath for these people in this place and that time is that that added political pressure, if you will, that not observing the Sabbath is not only something to be looked down on, but it's a mark of compromise.
Yeah. Political national compromise when all you want is your independence. You're just trying to get your independence and free God's people from this oppressive regime. And that's why I brought up, I brought up before, the Antonio Temple next to, built next to the Temple Mount so that, it wasn't as tall as the temple, but it was tall enough to see over the walls of the temple. Right?
Yeah, it was the Antonio Fortress.
Antonio Fortress. Yeah. Did I say temple?
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. The Antonio Fortress. Temple Fortress, yeah. But the Antonio Fortress that the Romans built there, so they could just sit there in that fortress and look down upon the activities of the Jews at their temple. And
literally and figuratively.
Yeah. And the Jews, unless you were at the top of the temple, which was a high honor and only a few, you were kind of in the shadow of that fortress all the time in the temple. And it was a constant reminder that these people aren't your friends. They don't like you and you don't like them. And when the Sabbath was a political win for you, that's just extra added intensity. Now, I don't know how much this was written to a Roman audience, Mark, most likely. And I don't know exactly where that Roman audience was and how much they would have been aware of that Roman-Jewish tension. But if they were talking to someone who had lived in that area, they likely would have been a little bit aware of that tension.
Right.
All right, I think that pretty much gets us through. Is there anything else we can say to kind of tie these past, 2 or 3 stories together before we move on to the next bit in our next episode?
No, but remember that Mark is not just throwing out random stories, that this is going somewhere, and Mark is taking us on a journey, if you will, that starts with the assertion that Jesus is the Son of God. And it marches us through this progression to the culmination of the crucifixion and resurrection. But it's not just random stories. We want to try to maintain the idea that there's a flow happening here, and that it's a story that's going someplace.
Right. And that's why sometimes, we're not really pointing out a spiritual point. We're just pointing out how the narrative flows. The spiritual points come, or the divine arguments, or however you want to see those things that connect to Jesus, God, life, the controversial stuff. That stuff comes throughout, but I think you and I would argue that that's best understood through understanding the whole narrative, which is why we continue to encourage you to do something called a pre-read. It's something I do. I still do. I do before we sit down to do these recordings, and I skim through the entire narrative of Mark from chapter 1 to chapter 16, because I want to make myself aware of the whole flow and keep reminding myself of the entire flow of the document. And it only takes 10 or 15 minutes to just read really quickly through those 16 chapters. You don't have to read every word, but you're getting a sense of everything that's going on. And if you want to really explore those kind of techniques, you can read a really boring and dry but great book called How to Read a Book by Mortimer J. Adler.
So how do you know how to read the book that's titled How to Read a Book?
Yeah, I was doing some video work at a conference with education professionals, and that I was reading that book in my spare time, and I got some interesting comments from some of the education professionals how to read a book, and I was trying to explain what the book is about, and it was a little bit comical to me how many people who work in education weren't really aware of that subject. And it really is a common thing before I started to learn. Sometimes you just think, well, it's words on page. Can't I just pick it up and read it and understand it? And then if you think about something like Shakespeare, well, no, you can't. Try and read, Troilus and Cressida, just on a whim and see how much of it you understand.
Right. Seriously, it is a good book. And it has a lot of helpful ideas on, everybody knows how to read a book, but getting more out of it, or understanding more of what is being said and how it's being said, can be very helpful.
Right. I especially appreciate and go back to frequently chapter 8 in that book, where it talks about sharing terms, that we all have a meaning when we say words. And communication really happens when the words that I say and the meaning that I intend with those words is the same meaning that you comprehend. And that's really what we're trying to do with these ancient authors, is understand what Mark meant when Mark wrote X, Y, or Z.
Right.
Anything else you have on this section, Everett?
No.
All right. Well, thanks for tuning in to the Jesus Discussion. Again, if you have questions, comments, critical or otherwise, feel free to send them to questions@thejesusdiscussion.com. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time. You have just been listening to The Jesus Discussion. You can subscribe to The Jesus Discussion at soundcloud.com, The Jesus Discussion, or on Podbean at thejesusdiscussion.podbean.com. You can find all of the ways to catch up on The Jesus Discussion at thejesusdiscussion.com. Thank you again for listening, and we hope that your day is truly a great one.